Narrative art is the name given to visual art that tells a story. People began telling stories through art as a way of communicating ideas to those who were unable to read. The most common instances are found in children's books and legendary mythical stories. Generally, the subject matter of narrative art has been religious or historical. Artists do invent their own stories, leaving the viewer to imagine the narrative. Artists can use elements such as colour, line, gesture, characters, composition, and symbolism to tell the story. The narrative artwork can depict either a single event or a medley of scenes. This type of art is in total contrast to traditional forms of landscape, still lifes, and portraits. Cohesion and repetition of the subject matter are factors often used in the narrative art. My scheme for my first year students was entitled Stories in Art, Explore and Investigate Art that Depicts a Narrative. Art history was a new subject to this first year group, and I wanted the students to comprehend that art history was interesting and not something to be dismissed. My rationale for electing narrative art as the foundation to their introduction to art history was based on the belief that the students would relate and engage with the concept. I felt it was important that the students became aware of the idea of subjectivity and individual perception, and believed narrative art allowed this experience and exploration. The aims of this scheme were very clear. I wanted the students to gain knowledge of what exactly narrative art is. I wanted them to understand how the artists incorporated visual elements to tell the story. Equally, I wanted the students to be capable of communicating their interpretations through qualitative language, written format, and visual content. A further aim was for the student to engage in the critical discussion and support their arguments with justifiable reason through identifying core elements of narrative art. On completion of this scheme, I anticipated that the learning outcomes for the students would involve being able to identify all modes of narrative art. I would anticipate they would understand the minor details used to tell the bigger idea. Students will be able to demonstrate their understanding of the artist's purpose through discussion and critical analysis. The student will be able to record visually and in written form their understanding of the criteria for narrative art. My first lesson was used to introduce students to narrative art and to allow them to gain knowledge of the various modes and visual details used to tell the story. Students had access to handouts, visual aids, and a PowerPoint presentation to facilitate this learning activity. Various types of narrative art were discussed, specifically continuous narrative such as relief columna, Trajana, The Passion by Hans Memling, sequential narrative, for example, scenes of the life of Christ, hypnotic and referential artworks. Learning strategies employed were class discussion and critical analysis. The purpose of discussion was to identify the content of narrative artworks, such as characters, expression, setting, purpose, and the artist's intent. Following on from this activity, students were provided with visual aids of the story of Joseph by Biagio di Antonio. This artwork was an example of continuous narrative. The purpose of this exercise was to investigate and explore an artwork in depth, using the knowledge gained. Initially, the students identified contents previously discussed. The students were then assigned in pairs to answer a standardized questionnaire. This was to encourage analysis of the artwork. Following this exercise, the students were provided with a handout. This informed them of the relevant details of the artwork. I used the students' work as a tool to evaluate this lesson. Their work comprised of a 3-part exercise. I instructed them to complete a standardized questionnaire and circle qualitative language, descriptive words, and phrases such as adjectives and adverbs. Secondly, they were to use this vocabulary to present a story in written form. The final part of the exercise was to translate this written transcript into a visual narrative of their choice, for example, continuous or sequential. The objectives of this lesson were to compare and contrast two works of art, Georges de la Tour's The Musician's Brawl and The Story of Joseph. Throughout this lesson, I utilised various resources to encourage active learning, such as visual aids on PowerPoint, handouts, questionnaires and group presentations. Another strategy used was probing questions, such as who is the main character, what is the setting, what do people's expressions, clothing, body language tell us about the artwork. The class was split up into groups, given visual aids of Georges de la Tour, The Musician's Brawl. This artwork is not identified by any specific narrative. The artist's story or intent is not known. Each group was assigned a possible narrative. These possible narratives were: the two musicians are fighting over a good corner in which to play music. The painting depicts a scene from a contemporary play. This painting is meant to illustrate a common proverb from the time: wretched is he who can find no more wretched than himself. The students had to put forward and present an argument to support their assigned narrative. Discussion and debate followed. The objective was achieved as students illustrated that they comprehended there existed no limits to the possible narratives. I wanted students to understand and be fully aware that art is subjective and interpretation individual. This is evident in the presentation to follow. Lesson 3 concentrated on developing the use of terminology and descriptive language. I felt it was essential that the students recognise the value of verbal language and how it could enhance the interpretation of the work of art. The works viewed were Dempsey and Furbo by George Bellows, The Fair at Reynosa by Carmen Garza, The Gleaners by Jean-Francois Millet. Emphasis was placed on the content of the narrative and relationships within the narrative, such as culture to people, people to culture, and people to nature. Students were asked to assign 3 descriptive words to each work. This was to illustrate their comprehension and knowledge of the lesson. This is an example of students' work showing how they use terminology, phrases, and descriptive language in their analysis of an artwork. Throughout this scheme, I employed various strategies to accommodate individual learning styles. These included visual aids, handouts, individual teaching, PowerPoint presentations, group and individual learning, demonstrations, written and creating. For my evaluation methods, I elected varied continuous assessment. I felt this would result in a more positive work as it allowed students to feel less pressured. Continuous assessment also facilitates each student to excel within their own personal skill set. Students who fail on examination arena often excel through this method. Although I recognise that the examination mode is inevitable, I do believe that there is a great value in building confidence and self-esteem. using the approaches I adopted for continuous assessment. Continuous assessment strategies included questionnaires, story and drawing and narrative art, compare and contrast session, and presentations. It also included the analysis of work using appropriate descriptive language. Throughout this scheme, I considered their participation, discussion, and work ethic within the class. This scheme produced both positive and negative outcomes. Students responded very well to fun-based activities, including presentation and creating a visual narrative. The creative practical element was received very well by all the students. Class discussion and presentations gave them the freedom to express themselves. They came to understand that in the art world there is no right or wrong answer in the interpretation of a visual piece. I do feel I set the interactive activities at the age-appropriate level. In contrast, the language and layout of my handouts were too advanced and failed to relate the information. On the second questionnaire, my questions were too ambiguous and allowing no definite answer. On reflection of this scheme, I do believe that overall it was successful and based this evaluation on the interaction and learning activities that accommodated the students' creativity.